Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in to another fantastic SAP speaker series. My name is Julia Schlier and I'm the head of HanaHaus here in Newport Beach. Today I'm super excited about our guest speaker. Amazingly, he was in our HanaHaus space for a few meetings before, and today he's back with us, even though it's just virtually. Welcome, Henrik Fisker. Thanks for joining us today. Henrik is an entrepreneur, innovator, and a leading automotive designer, and we will hear him talk about a clean future for all. And maybe he will share with us what he's up to. So today's speaker series will be moderated by our SAP Global Head of Innovation Center Network, Hans Martin Will. And without further ado, please welcome Martin and Henrik.
So welcome everybody. And first of all, thank you so much for being with us today, Henrik. So we've all been very much looking forward to this conversation with you. Maybe to open up this conversation, let's start actually at the very early beginning. So the path to where you today really started back in Denmark. Maybe it's just first question, when did you realize this is what I want to do, this is what I'm meant to do, I want to be an automotive designer?
Well, thanks, Martin, and it's great to be here on the show. You know, when I was a kid, like probably most kids, you know, I drew cars in school, and eventually when everybody stopped and sort of grew up, I kept drawing cars, and I guess that was sort of the first time when I realized I wanted to have something to do with cars, and I went into my counselor, which was sort of supposed to counsel you on what you want to be when you grow up. I said, I want to be a car designer. And I remember she said, there's nothing called a car designer. You can become an engineer. So I went home to my dad and he said, well, why don't you write a letter to Volvo? Since I was living in Denmark, sort of Volvo in Sweden was the closest. So I wrote over to them saying, hey, look, I'd like to join. I'll sweep the floors. I do whatever I have to do. I want to just have anything to do with cars. And they basically wrote back saying, look, we don't hire people like that straight out of, normal school. You first have to go to college, then you have to get a degree in car design. They explained me there's a school in America called Arts and the College of Design. So that was sort of the first time that I realized there was a direction to become a car designer.
Thank you. I think it's quite illustrative how, as a young kid, you had to find your way really towards the industry. So I'm a little bit fast forwarding now in your career. So you obviously decided to get into the car designer profession. You're spending some time at BMW and then on to Aston Martin. And I guess in both places, you have tremendous success building truly iconic cars. And moving forward further, at some point, you're a director heading up Ford's global design team, and then suddenly the decision, well, I'm going to leave and start my own luxury design firm. Obviously, that's a really big step and also probably quite a bit of risk associated with that. So is building your own company something you always knew you want to do as well? That you really were meant to be an entrepreneur and want to start your own company, or did it come out of more to you through other reasons? Can you walk us a bit through that decision process of really stepping out of a corporation and building out your own company?
So I think I always wanted to, of course, own my own car company, etc. I think that's sort of a dream somebody has. But when I came out of school, and started working at BMW, it really wasn't on my mind, because the car industry is such a huge industry where everybody's conglomerates. You spend billions of dollars. So it wasn't like if I would have come out and said, I can kind of make my own little video game or something. It was such a huge thing that it sort of disappeared in the background. And I was excited about getting into the car industry, working on some of the first cars that I worked on, the BMW Z8 and Aston Martins, etc. And it was first later, after I had sort of spent some time at Aston Martin, and we had, we're starting to launch the vehicles there. And I remember sitting thinking one day, maybe I've reached the top as far as I can go in the corporate world. and maybe it is time to go out and do something. And my idea was not immediately start another car company, because that still seemed like a giant idea. It was more about going out, maybe making some specialty cars. I've had a few people through the years ask me, why don't you just go out and design a car for me? I'll pay you something. Or why don't you start your own design company? And of course, there was some design companies out there building specialty cars. So it seems like sort of a good idea. And I remember taking the decision. I had talked to a few sort of friends, which were fairly wealthy, and they said, we'll throw in a little bit of money if you start. So the process sort of slowly came along, and I thought I'd prepared myself as good as I could, and it turned out I really didn't. I had no clue what it meant to leave the corporate world and go and jump out and become an entrepreneur. And from the outside, it seems really glamorous, because you can kind of wake up when you want, work when you want, and you're fully in charge. But you also, I didn't have any idea about what it meant to pay rent, or who's going to pick up the toilet paper to put in the toilets, and who's booking my flights, and wow, is business class so expensive? I didn't know. And wow, I don't have a company car anymore. All this type of stuff that suddenly disappeared. Not having an assistant, not having just the whole infrastructure of a giant company that you take for granted. That was a huge lessons learned, and it was tough. It was difficult, much more difficult than I thought. So it was a bit of a shock to jump out from such a big industry that the car industry really is.
I can see that. And maybe just a follow-up question just on that aspect. So particularly maybe for some of these guests we have joining us today who are also thinking about breaking away from a big corporation, starting their own company, own firm, is there any specific advice you would give them what they should consider as they're making that transition, kind of going from that infrastructure-rich corporate environment into being on your own as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I think that, when I look back now, there's a couple of things that I definitely would think about knowing everything now. And that is, first, you should think about whether you really have got to the point in your career where you feel you're ready. And is there any more you can do in your career first to learn even more, to be even more successful, maybe even to save some money? Because once you go as an entrepreneur, you could be without money for maybe 6 months, a year, or even longer, because it may not go as planned. So you should definitely have some money tucked away. Secondly, I would say you really need to kind of step back a little bit from the overall excitement and the overall sort of positiveness of what you think it could be, and then probably do a little bit of what many investors do, is they sort of always make the worst case scenario. And it doesn't have to be a scenario which is detrimental, but maybe a scenario where you really sit down and think about, what does it really cost to have an office, if that's what I need? What does it really cost to have a couple of people that I need? And what do I put away from travel? So trying to make a real serious budget, and that will help you when you go out and talk to investors, and to truly understand what you need in capital to be successful. And then finally, I would say, of course, it depends what business you go into, but I think it's very helpful if you can identify some of your staff or some of your partners as you start, so you don't start looking for them and need to make quick decisions on people you may not ultimately like to work with. Because starting in a startup where you're maybe working with just a handful of people or even less, you're around each other every day, you're through extremely tense moments, you have to make incredible, difficult decisions. There's a huge amount of stress you haven't had before. So you got to make sure you work with people who really are able to work together with you in those stressful situations that many times probably ends up being more work than you're used to. It usually becomes 7 days of work thinking about that job all the time, at least until you get up to a certain running level. So there's many things you have to consider as you move out, and also look at what does the competition look like? What is the market I want to get into? Is my idea revolutionary and different enough to succeed? I think in this cluttered environment we're in today with social media and overload of products and ideas, it's not enough just to feel you're improving something 3%. You've got to be dramatically different to stand out and to get the interest of investors.
No, thank you. It's very, very insightful. And I mean, you touched now also as part of your response on the people topic, right? Finding the right kind of partners, particularly in the early stages, the right kind of team that you can start out with. Maybe related to that, how would you describe your own leadership style? What qualities are you looking for? What do you value both in yourself and in those people you bring together, particularly in the early stages?
So I think my leadership style changed during my sort of entrepreneurial years. I would say when I came straight out of BMW and Aston Martin and Ford, specifically at BMW, there was, I think, a pretty good culture of everybody kind of knowing what they were doing, taking responsibility and being self-initiated. And that became a bit of my expectations of people. And I think I've slowly changed in my entrepreneurial years to get a little more involved, more detailed, even if people don't really like it. I know most people like to be sort of left alone and trusted, and that's fine in big organizations, whereas if there is a mistake, you can find a way to solve it. You can go over budget a little bit, and then you go and get more budget from your superiors, and you somehow figure it out. The problem is when you're in a startup atmosphere and an entrepreneur, and specifically in the early days, your budgets are so tight that even the smallest mistake can cost the life of the company. So I think as annoying as it is, you need to be really, in the details with everything that goes on in the company. You have to really involve yourself with spending on any area, whether it's just general spending or product spending or program spending. It's extremely important. Something that is not really down my alley, but I do it. When it comes to my leadership style, I do believe in giving people enough freedom and trust them in what they're doing. I believe in discussing ideas early on and making decisions quick. I think one of the worst things is if there's no decisions, whether it's a good or bad decision, it's actually better than no decision. So I believe in making decisions and stand by them and try to avoid to change them. So people have a clear idea and focus about what you're doing. I believe in setting out a clear vision for people. That's important. And then I believe in a very, very open culture. And what I mean by that, most of us are used to coming from very sort of giant companies that there's always, maybe just because it's such a big companies, that there's a culture of political intrigues and there's a way you make career. Sometimes you kind of have to play along the games and all that stuff. And my leadership style is really to avoid all that and bring things out in the open right away, call people out if there is some issues like that. Fundamentally, one of the things that I've spent actually some time on now is ESG, which is environmental social governance. And I just find that if you put these things out right away, whether it's intrigue between certain groups or whether it's harassment that's happening, all that stuff needs to come out in the open and getting solved quickly. I believe in solving problems really early, even if it's a bit sometimes confrontational or embarrassing, or it's not comfortable to do it. It just has to be done. Finally, I think one of my biggest learnings through my entrepreneurial career have been that you interview people, you try and do your best to get people on board that you feel good about and you hope they are going to fit in your organization. Reality is that sometimes it just doesn't happen. And I kind of feel that there is a span where you can have people coming in and they may not really adjust right away, and they need some coaching, some help, and some time. And you have to spend some more time with them, explaining what the vision is, explaining what you like to do and what you think they do wrong and what you would like them to do. But then eventually there comes a tipping point. And that tipping point for me is coming much earlier now than it was when I was younger and early in my career. The tipping point is where you have to recognize, will this person fit an organization or not? And it's a very tough thing, but I have found lately that it's better to make this decision earlier, because it actually helps both people, both yourself as the manager or whatever you call yourself, and the employee or the partner, because it actually takes some of that pain out where both people are waiting and hoping that the other will change, and you're beyond the point where that will happen. So what usually happens in that situation is you actually end up ruining more. You sometimes even, hurt programs. You upset other employees because everybody's waiting for this sort of rotten apple to disappear. So making those difficult decisions earlier is something I've learned, and it's tough, but you have to do it. And you can do it in a as amicable way as you can. But I think bringing it up front and saying, I just don't think there's a fit here, and for both of us, and there's no point in keeping on because it isn't going to work. So that's another point which I think is important, to make sure you have a streamlined business with people who will work really well together, and you're going to have really good results.
Mm. Are there specific symptoms or indicators that help you around this cultural fit, or how do you?
Yeah, I think that. Look, I also believe, by the way, in motivating people. So you have to constantly get in with the teams that are working on the job, and you got to motivate them, saying we're working for this great, amazing idea. And you also got to call people out when they're doing a great job. And I think when you start realizing that somebody may not fit in the role in the company is usually if they don't really they don't take criticism, first of all, and they don't follow the simple procedures in the company. They just ignore them. And sometimes, when somebody's really smart and do something really well, you can sort of look away from that a couple of times, but eventually you got to say, look, this is how the company's run. Everybody follows this procedure. Everybody does this. And if they still don't want to do it, you start realizing there's going to be a disruption where it isn't going to work. Obviously, if people are not team players, at the end of the day, we all have to work in a team. And again, there you can have some conversations as well. So there is some little indicators. They're not always the same, but ultimately it leads to a lack of productivity, either from the person itself or people around that person. And that's when you need to kind of make that decision, because there is a point where it just isn't going to turn around.
No, thank you. So maybe let me switch subjects a little bit and talk a little bit more about the kind of products you have been building over the last years. And I mean, something that's really remarkable is that you entered the hybrid electric vehicle space very early on, back in 2007. So maybe a question there is kind of what drew you to building a sustainable vehicle, and why was it so important to you?
It was sort of a crazy way it happened. But first of all, just a little background. I'm from Denmark originally, even though I'm American now, but I have both passports, which is great. So I could actually travel around Europe here not long ago. So that helped. But, in Denmark, I grew up with, getting a slap on my hand if I threw a chocolate piece of paper on the ground, and if I didn't turn off the light when I left the room. So it was sort of a normal thing. And then, of course, when you move to America, where there's sort of abundance of things, and before it became kind of cool to sort of be more sustainable, it was a sort of a big culture shock. Didn't think much about it. And then I think that sort of a big thing suddenly happened, and that was actually it sort of slowly happened even when I was working in Germany on vehicles for BMW, that there was already a bit of a movement coming out of Greenpeace and other groups sort of, painting the car as an evil polluter in society. And even to the point, I remember at one point at BMW, there was a special M version that was canceled because it was at the height and they didn't want to, go out and be controversial. And I remember start thinking about there's got to be a change in this industry, because how do we preserve the fundamental idea of private transportation, which I think, people still love. Everybody likes to have that private transportation. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning dreaming about taking the bus, but you wake up dreaming about maybe one day buying a sports car or getting in your car, whatever it might be. So it's convenience that we like. So I started thinking about how do we, get the car back into becoming part of our society, but I didn't have really a solution for it as I was generally designing cars until it was about in 2006, I think. I saw Leonardo DiCaprio driving to the Oscars in a Toyota Prius. And I thought, here's a guy that can definitely afford a better car than that. But it was clear he wanted to make a statement. And that kind of gave me an idea, why not designing a really cool plug-in hybrid? Because that was sort of the technology that I could imagine at that time. And but also loaded up with some other ideas. So we put the world's largest solar roof on the vehicle at that time. And we were the first to make, I think, a total vegan interior. We used reclaimed wood from the California fires. We did all this stuff that, quite honestly, we were probably too early. And Leonardo actually did end up buying the first car, which were really cool. And we sold a few thousand, but it was definitely early on. We launched that vehicle about a year and a half before the Tesla Model S. So we were very early out. But that's sort of how it started up. And now coming in today, when we start, or in 2016, when we started Fisker, my having done the Fisker Karma was a $100,000 car. And I thought, to really get, this sort of sustainable vehicles out to a broader market, we need to find a way to get the prices down. And I started examining the whole business model that in itself became a little bit of a revolution, what we came up with, because the car industry has not really changed for the last 100 years in terms of how you develop a car, then you manufacture a car, then you ship the car to a dealer, and then the car gets sold. So the car makers are spending a ton of money up front developing a product. Then they spend a ton of money building a factory to make it. And then they spend a ton of money to pay a dealer to sell it. And then that was a one-time sale, and they never see that customer again, or they may or may not see that customer again. So we kind of decided there's room for a real disruption here. And maybe in the middle of that disruption, we find a way to lower the price of the product itself, because we take so much of that kind of overhead and waste away that we are just taking for granted in the car industry. And we were able to do that because we started a clean sheet of paper. So for us, it became above and beyond just making another electric car. It was really about creating a new business model for the car industry, as well, of course, trying to create the world's most sustainable vehicle by adding more sustainability beyond the electric powertrain.
I want to get to a couple of these points you just raised in a second. Maybe just before we get there, though, just looking back at, say, the creation of the Fisker Karma, and looking back also now from the current perspective, are there things, as you look back, you would have done differently even at the time?
I get this question a lot, and I would say, of course, with the knowledge and the experience I have today, I would go back and I would say exactly some of the things where I think I've improved. So I would have been tougher with a few employees earlier and quicker. But that was probably not one of the bigger areas. I think two other big areas, and which we have done today, is I would have set up the entire process of funding the company different. I think back in the day, we had too many Silicon Valley investors, quite frankly, that all had different ideas and wanted influence in the company. And that was stuff that I, at that time, really I wasn't aware of any of that, because I'd never done any venture funding. So this time we have done it very different. We have secured funding for our entire program all the way to start of production. And then third, I would say trying to de-risk areas which may not be the most important for your product or the first service or product you launch. Where you can innovate, but do you need to right away? Now, at the time, unfortunately, we were stuck with a battery company called A123, and there was only 3 battery companies in the world that really delivered to automotive. There was Panasonic, which were with Tesla, LG Kim with GM, and then we had A123. So we didn't really have a choice, but it definitely was on my mind. As that company went bankrupt during our launch, we couldn't continue. As we started Fisker this time, I really looked at areas where we should de-risk to not take any unnecessary technology risk as we were launching our first program, because so some of these areas are not vital for our brand. So we are not taking risk, for instance, with the battery. We're not taking risk with manufacturing. We're not taking risk with having a platform, that is super well engineered and all that. So we're taking the risk somewhere else where we find it's important. So I think finding out where you want to take risk and where you don't want to take risk. Risk is easier once you have an up and running company, because now you can afford failures. But if you only have one product, you really can't afford it to fail when you launch in any area.
Thank you. Now, you just touched also on the Silicon Valley culture, the venture capitalists living there. Now, coincidentally, you just made an announcement last week that you actually will be opening a new facility in San Francisco. And you're also based in Southern California right now. So can you talk a little bit more, just your thoughts around being in California, the reason for being here, and maybe just the benefits of this overall ecosystem, but maybe also the difference between the Southern California style and community versus what we find in the Bay Area?
Yeah, look, I don't want to mix in, Silicon Valley necessarily with just investors. They happen to be up there, and I'm sure there's some amazing investment firms. But I think the culture in Silicon Valley generally, what I like there is extremely, of course, tech focused, and that's really where you have, a lot of the talent. And when you look at Los Angeles, it's slightly different culture. And we kind of felt we needed both. Not that we can't find tech people here in LA as well, but there's a certain type of tech people we were looking for, specifically around software development, that may not want to leave San Francisco. So we decided, why not just open a development center, which we happen to call Source Code, in San Francisco, and it allows us to hire talent without trying to convince people they have to move to LA and spend time on all that, and just say, hey, you can just stay here. We got an office, and so it's such a short flight. I think part of the reason we also felt really comfortable opening it so quickly is all the lessons learned during COVID, where we're all working from home. It worked really well. Of course, we need to get back to the office to build hardware, but a lot of stuff can be done virtually. And specifically when you work in software, it's very easy. So the cultural difference there is that software development, having access to the talent, LA is just part of our DNA. We are, as much as we might be a tech company, we are also, I would say, sort of a laid back, cool car company. We don't want to conform to everybody else. We are not trying to copy Tesla. We're not vertically integrated. We're about having some fun. We want to show fun and sustainability can come together. We want to come out with some real cool cars that are emotional, but driven by this mission of creating the world's most sustainable vehicles. But we don't want to forget the fun, the coolness, the emotional design. And that's probably slightly more LA. And that's, I think, is going to be a big differentiator from what we are doing to some of the other, specifically electric car startups.
Can you maybe also talk a little bit more about the role of software as you think about the end-to-end conception of a car? Because that probably has changed quite a bit also over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so reality is that, a car of the future, and already is happening as we speak, is essentially becoming a computer on wheels, in the sense that in the old days, you would spend a ton of time in a car, setting up the suspension, going out, lying under the car, adjusting the suspension. You would adjust the steering with some sort of mechanicals. Everything was adjusted mechanical until the car was set up to feel like that brand. Let's say it might have been a BMW. That's how a BMW feels. The steering is like this, the suspension is like this, the brakes feels like that. And every car is different. So when you go in one car to another, the brake pedal feels different, the steering feels different. And that used to be all mechanical. In the future, and by the way, it's already happening, but in the future, all these areas of character in the vehicle is going to be done by software, everything, which means you got to have a super expertise in that area. Secondly, as we all can see, cars are becoming sort of an extension of our personal computers that we have, mainly, a smartphone or whatever it might be, an iPad or whatever. And it has to be fully connected. And then the entire user interface in the car is going to change completely. We are sort of in a vacuum right now where a lot of car makers are taking what we see on an iPad and putting it into a car. And the problem, of course, is that, the difference is when you sit on an iPad on your couch, you're pretty focused, nothing's moving, and you can, look at as much as you want. But when you're driving in a car, not only are you need to look at the road, but you also have uneven roads still and will have in the future. So hitting a button on a screen in a car while driving 65 miles an hour and going on a bumpy road is not the same as sitting in your couch, hitting a button on an iPad. So I fundamentally believe you're going to see a big change in user interface. That's something we want to be leading in, and we are pretty excited about. And so you need software engineers, but you also need visual for that, visual graphic designers, three-dimensional understanding of what happens in the whole user experience. So it's a whole new area for the car industry. It's very exciting. There's a lot of disruption and innovation to be done there. And personally, I believe it's very long time before we will have fully self-driving cars, which means, of course, when you have fully self-driving, now you can argue and go back and just sit and look at a screen. But I don't think in this generation of cars, meaning the next 7 years, that you privately are going to be able to buy a vehicle without a steering wheel that can go anywhere at any time, which is called level 5 autonomous vehicles. You may have level 3, level 3.5, maybe level 4, but those are not 100% fully autonomous vehicles.
So as we're now talking about this near-term time frame, probably a lot of the people who have joined us today, they're also interested in learning more about your current product, right, the Fisker Ocean. Can you talk a bit more about what that is about and how this is become the world's most sustainable vehicle?
Yeah, so the idea was to really do something different, not just make it look like some of the other electric vehicles out there. And the mission of and the vision we have is a clean future for all. So how do you achieve that? Well, I'm not going to achieve that if I'm only trying to get somebody who already drives an electric car into our electric car. So for instance, yes, maybe there's a few Tesla owners that will buy our vehicle, but just to go after the Tesla owners wouldn't make any sense because we're not changing the world. So we decided to do an SUV that looks like an SUV rather than sort of a fastback crossover. And the reason is that this is the fastest growing market in the world, both in Europe, US, and China. And we think we can get most people that way out of their current gasoline SUVs and into our vehicle. Now, part of what we wanted to do was also create some new ideas that would attract you to this vehicle, even if it wasn't electric, no matter what it was. So one is we create something called the California mode, where you can roll down all the windows at the push of a button, meaning not just the side windows, but the rear quarter windows and the rear window. And it's both a fun aspect where you feel like a convertible, but it's also utilitarian. You can stick in a long thing from Home Depot or a surfboard in the back. So that was sort of something new that we did and we have worked on. We're also working on the product itself, integrating a lot of recyclable materials. So all the carpets are made from plastic bottles and fishing nets from the ocean. We're using recycled materials in many other areas of the vehicle. And finally, we thought about there's a whole new generation of young people who probably would like to buy a real sustainable electric vehicle, but may not be able to afford it, or don't want to go out and borrow $50,000 or whatever and pay it off over 7 years. So part of our entire business model and streamlining the business itself was to be able to offer a flexible lease, which nobody's done for a new car. And essentially means you can lease the car and give it back anytime. You can give it back after a month, 6 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever you want. And it really takes you off that commitment of 3 years that you normally have to do with a lease. And for us, it's a really interesting business model because we have a reoccurring revenue over 8 years while we own that vehicle, and we lease it out to maybe 5 or 6 different people at different rates. But it's an interesting business model where we allow our customers much more flexibility, much more affordable because all maintenance included, full warranty. And we're also looking at lowering the insurance premium as well. So it's a new type of mobility product that we kind of, I would say, dreamt up, if you want, that was sort of combination between the hardware and how you actually sell and service the vehicle, because you also don't never have to take this vehicle to service. We'll pick it up and get it serviced. We have a deal with some independent large service organizations to do that. So it makes that whole hassle-free experience, but with a really cool vehicle. And that was sort of the idea behind the Fisker Ocean, which would be a first model of several new models we'll bring out, but we'll start with this one. It's coming out in end of 2022. We unfortunately already sold out for 22 because we have over 8,000 reservations already on beer.
So it seems that this concept of affordability really is key part of the concept here. So beyond kind of the service model and the financial model you've been adding, were there other changes you had to make to just think about how to set up the company, how the company is operating, or how these vehicles are built?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, I would say affordability. I would also say value for money. Because you can buy a cheap car that you don't feel is valuable because it may seem cheap, but then it doesn't do what you want it to do. So for us, it was about whatever the car cost, unless if you get the base version for $37,500, you should feel that this is a better car than any other car you're choosing, even if it's a gasoline car. So that was important. Now, to achieve all that, we had to set up a company that was much more efficient than any car company today. So we decided to kind of be a little bit more like Apple Foxconn, if you want. So we're outsourcing manufacturing to a very known manufacturing group. We are doing joint development or sharing a platform with other OEMs, which means a base steel stamped or aluminum stamped parts underneath, because we don't feel that's going to be a big differentiator in the future. Car makers already today do a bit of that in gasoline cars, but it hasn't been done with electric vehicles. And finally, we created our own proprietary app. So right now you can go in, you can download the Fisker app, you can reserve a car for $250 on the app, and ultimately you'll be able to do everything on this app as we keep expanding it. So we see ourselves as a digital car company, and for that, I felt I need to surround myself with some really brilliant people, both inside the company on the working level, hence starting the Silicon Valley office, where our CTO was before with a chip maker. So that's kind of a little unusual. And then also with an amazing board. We got 3 women on our board, so we have a very, I would say, a very diverse but also smart board in very many different directions. Surround myself with people from the software industry, because that's definitely not one of my strong points. I couldn't do much in software at all. It's not something that I'm specialist in, so I need to have the absolute best specialist around me in the company and advisors. So the whole company is set up to really be a digital car company where you can go in an app, get the vehicle, give it back anytime, no hassle. And we think that's the real future of the automotive industry. And that's really where we want to take the lead.
No, thank you. So on this topic of future of automotive industry, so we just had the announcement here out of California, essentially the plan to ban the sales of new gas-powered vehicles starting 15 years from now, right, in 2035. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, obviously you're very much ahead of the curve here in building the next generation of vehicles, but more generally, what do you expect will come out of that legal guidance, and how do you see that or similar regulations being adopted in other parts of the country, other states, or more at a global scale?
Well, first of all, it costs billions of dollars to develop vehicles, and the car industry is facing a huge, I would say, task, or a bit of a huge risk as well. And that is that if the car industry have to simultaneously develop 3 or 4 different propulsion, powertrains and develop new technologies, they just won't have money enough to do it. And I think generally, when we look at rules and regulations, the car industry are usually pretty much begging the lawmakers to give clear direction and try and make the same laws and regulations for all states, preferably several countries or continents, because that lowers the development costs for the car makers. And that is starting to happen in safety. It hasn't been there in emissions. I think what California and Governor Newsom is trying to do is to sort of give a clear direction of where we need to go, and trying to ensure the car makers that that's what's going to happen, and therefore you can concentrate on EVs. Of course, California is not enough. You need all of US to really be behind this, because you can't create vehicles just for California. It's too expensive. However, it's obviously a step that's sending a clear signal, and I think the signal is really just echoing what is going to happen anyway. In Europe, there's already several countries that have already made those decisions as well. In Europe, there is, and in China, I think it's going to happen as well. Could even happen earlier. My prediction is China will go fully electric by 2030, 5 years earlier. Now, when all that happens, America is going to end up being sort of a smaller, isolated island in the big picture. When you look at car sales globally, it's about 80 million vehicles a year. America's about, in a good year, 17 million. So the car industry works in the only way it can work is that it's got to be a global movement. So the question is, when is that tipping point where we go fully electric? Because the car industry probably can't afford to make half electric cars and half gasoline cars. And then we come to the point of pollution. And that's anyway the point where we need to do something, and we can either keep spending billions on improving the gasoline engine, which really isn't improving that much, or we can go all the way and just get it done with electrification. Now, ultimately, I think that it's always better if you can get customers to buy into something without having to ban it. Eventually, customers bought into getting off the horse and into a car. And eventually, of course, you couldn't take the horse out on the Autobahn, on the freeway, because it just couldn't fulfill the minimum speed limit out there, and it would be too dangerous. So ideally, what you would like to see is a natural progression of electric vehicles, and hopefully a tipping point where it goes really quick, and then you end up with maybe just having historical cars and maybe a few sports cars. So just like today, you go to a horse show and you enjoy the beautiful horses, but you really don't take your horse and ride to work every day on it. I mean, maybe a few people, farmers do it, but it's really not done generally in the big cities. So I think what will happen is that you will find very quickly most people's daily driver to go to work will be an electric car. Whether somebody then wants to have a Ferrari in the weekend that is not electric, maybe. And I think this tipping point will most likely happen quicker than we think. And I kind of compare it to the automatic transmission here in the US and the manual. There was suddenly a tipping point where the manual transmission was, I think it was less than 40% sold. And suddenly the car makers, whether they were BMW, whoever, they just decided, let's not even import the manual anymore, because we can't afford to have these manuals sitting on the parking lot. We don't know if they're going to sell or not. We don't want to have to service them. We don't want to have to have double spare parts. So they just decided, hey, there's not enough demand. Let's stop it. There was a few people complained, but now pretty much all cars are automatic. And that was a tipping point where the shift went so quickly. Now, I think you're going to see the same with electric cars, that it's going to get to a point where it just doesn't make sense for a lot of car makers to have both vehicles. But I also think even more, just like what happened with the iPhone, where nobody really said we need buttons on the phone anymore. I think that's going to happen with electric cars, where people actually, when you drive an electric car, you realize, I don't really need a gasoline car. There's really nothing about this vehicle that has any advantage towards an electric car, except, okay, if I go on a super long 1,000-mile trip, but how often do you do that? You know, and even then, I believe in about 3 to 4 years from now, you're going to see we're going to have about the same amount of charging stations as we have gasoline stations. And you're going to get charging times down to 10 minutes for a decent charge. So in 3, 4, 5 years, you're not going to miss the gasoline engine unless you want to go racing and specifically listen to, you know, the gasoline sound and smell the fuel. But are you sitting in traffic on the way to work? Electric cars way better by far.
No, thank you. That was very helpful, I think, for all of us to understand here. So maybe as last question from my end before we open up to questions from the audience. So just this morning, you announced that coincidentally, SAP's former CEO, Bill McDermott, is joining your board of directors. Is there anything more you can share about this and what that means for you?
Yeah, I got to know Bill recently and becoming a really good friend. And, you know, he has such a clear vision and he really understands the whole software and digital side. And I really wanted somebody on board that has, you know, a vision of changing the future to becoming much simpler, much easier to operate, and really is done through software systems and how you know, really organize your entire business as well. So it's both when you talk about customers, but also how you organize the business. And I thought it was really great to get him on board, to addition to our board, to have that person, which of course he's now in Silicon Valley, and kind of have his background. I thought was perfect. And I guess it's a sign of times that, you know, I'd rather have somebody like him on board than, you know, taking some traditional car guy, because that's not really what we need. So, and besides that, I just think generally getting to know Bill, he's just an amazing leader and has such a, you know, huge career behind him, international as well. I think that was important that he actually had run SAP in Germany, because, you know, the automotive industry is international. So I thought that was a great addition to the board.
No, thank you. So I'm just looking at questions we got in from the audience, and maybe here's one. I'm just reading it out. So as a car company, will the Ocean be the only type of SUV, or will you eventually offer other models with different design directions?
Yeah, we'll offer other models, absolutely. We already have designed a concept car called the E-Motion, which is a sort of super luxury sports sedan. We're going to bring that to market. It'll be changed. We have some new ideas. It was designed a few years ago, but that essence of super emotional vehicle like that we'll bring to market. I could also see us bring a more luxurious, sportier SUV to market, maybe even a vehicle sitting slightly below the Ocean. We'll see, that will be later. And then we are sort of studying the whole idea of a lifestyle pickup truck. It seems to be a super hot market right now. And we're kind of trying to find out exactly what does that mean and where does it go. I don't think we'll make a sort of a workers pickup truck, because that's not really our brand. But there's a lot of people who probably think it's fun to maybe have a lifestyle pickup truck where you can easily throw stuff in the back, not worry about it. So that's something we're starting as well. But if we do it, it has to be radically different than anything else out there.
Thank you. Another question that came in is really about distribution partners. So it is based on your market research from years ago to present. any worries about teaming up with a solid distribution partner?
I did not. Can you say the last?
Yeah, if there are any worries about teaming up with a solid distribution partner or the role of a distribution partner.
No, so we don't have any distribution partners. So we will distribute direct, just like when you order something from Amazon, they deliver it at home. So we'll deliver your car to you at home, direct from us, or you can come and pick it up at one of our experience centers. We will have, of course, some experience center where you can go and see the car, book a test drive. So we won't have distributors. What we will have is service partners, and we're not worried about those because they already exist. One, we have already announced an MOU is Cox Automotive here in the US. They already do service for large fleets, warehousing, logistics, and that is just a lean way of doing business. I think it's not necessary to have people go to get their car serviced, get a loan a car, sign papers. We want to get all that hassle away.
Got it. Thank you so much for explaining that. So I'm actually not seeing another question right now that was forwarded here. So I think with that, thank you so much again for sharing your views and perspectives here, answering all our questions. It was great to have you as a guest here. We're all very much looking forward to seeing these new vehicles on our streets. And we'll definitely take a closer look when they become available.
Thank you, Martin. Good to be here. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for dialing in. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Take care.